Edward Halpern's hands were steady as he inserted the pick into the lock, his tools clicking softly in the quiet hallway of the Burlington Research Institute. It was just another routine job, changing locks for a visiting academic, until his fingers brushed against something that shouldn't have been there. A thin strip of metal, deliberately hidden, engraved with sequences that made his blood run cold. He didn't know this wasn't just a lock. He didn't know the man in room 314 had been stealing classified biological data for months. He didn't know this single discovery would unravel a Soviet espionage network that stretched from Vermont to Moscow. But as he held that cipher in his trembling hands, one question burned in his mind: how deep did this conspiracy go? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning of October 15th, 1962, began like any other Monday for Eddie Halpern. He woke at 5:30 in his small apartment above the Locksmith shop on Church Street, the autumn chill seeping through the old windows that overlooked downtown Burlington. At 43 years old, Eddie had settled into a comfortable routine that rarely varied. Coffee first, always black, then a quick scan of the Burlington Free Press while eating 2 pieces of toast with strawberry jam. His wife Clara had left him 3 years ago, taking their daughter Michelle to Boston, and the silence of the apartment had become both his companion and his torment. Eddie descended the narrow wooden stairs to his shop at 6:15, flipping the sign from closed to open, even though he knew no customers would arrive for at least another hour. The shop smelled of metal shavings and machine oil, a scent that had become as familiar to him as his own skin. He had inherited the business from his father, Joseph Halpern, who had emigrated from Poland in 1928 with nothing but a toolbox and the knowledge passed down through 4 generations of locksmiths. Eddie had learned the trade at his father's elbow, spending countless hours as a boy watching those gnarled hands manipulate pins and tumblers with the precision of a surgeon. The shop itself was narrow and deep, crammed with key-cutting machines, lock displays, and wooden drawers containing hundreds of different pins, springs, and mechanisms. The front window displayed various padlocks, deadbolts, and the new cylindrical locks that were becoming popular in commercial buildings. A faded poster from the Master Lock Company hung on one wall, its edges curling with age. Eddie took pride in his work, in the knowledge that he was one of the best locksmiths in Vermont, maybe in all of New England. He could decode a lock by touch alone, identify the manufacturer of a key by the pattern of its cuts, and pick even the most sophisticated mechanisms in under 2 minutes. By 8:30, Eddie had cut 6 keys for walk-in customers, repaired a stubborn front door lock for Mrs. Henderson from Pine Street, and was working on a custom deadbolt installation when the phone rang. He wiped his hands on his work apron and lifted the heavy black receiver. The voice on the other end was crisp and professional, belonging to a woman who introduced herself as Margaret Sutton, administrative director at the Burlington Research Institute. Eddie knew the place by reputation, a private facility that had opened 2 years earlier, supposedly focused on agricultural and biological research. It occupied a converted mansion on the outskirts of town, a grand Victorian structure that had once belonged to the Whitmore family before they lost their fortune in the Depression. Margaret explained that they needed locks changed in several rooms, standard procedure for visiting researchers who were completing their rotations. She asked if Eddie could come that afternoon, preferably before 3 o'clock. The pay would be generous, she assured him, $50 for what she estimated would be 2 hours of work. Eddie agreed immediately. $50 was more than he usually made in a full day, and the afternoon was light on appointments. He arrived at the Burlington Research Institute at 1:30, driving his 1956 Ford pickup truck up the long gravel driveway that wound through maple trees aflame with October colors. The mansion loomed ahead, its Victorian gables and turrets giving it an almost Gothic appearance against the gray autumn sky. Eddie parked near the service entrance as Margaret had instructed and gathered his toolbox from the truck bed. Margaret Sutton met him at the door, a thin woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair pulled into a tight bun. She wore a blue cardigan over a white blouse and had the efficient manner of someone who had spent decades managing complicated logistics. She led Eddie through a service corridor that smelled of floor wax and disinfectant, past several laboratories with frosted glass windows, and up a narrow staircase to the 3rd floor. The 3rd floor was quieter than the rest of the building, with thick carpet muffling their footsteps. Margaret explained that this floor housed temporary accommodations for visiting researchers, scholars who came for 3 to 6 month rotations to collaborate on various projects. She stopped in front of room 314 and produced a key from her pocket. The room beyond was modest, containing a single bed, a desk, a dresser, and a small bookshelf. Personal belongings were minimal: a few books in Russian, some papers scattered on the desk, a photograph of an elderly woman in a silver frame. Margaret explained that the previous occupant, Dr. Pavel Kirov, had completed his research rotation and departed 2 days earlier, returning to his position at the University of Leningrad. Standard protocol required changing all locks when a room changed occupancy. Eddie set his toolbox on the floor and examined the existing lock. It was a standard pin tumbler mechanism, probably installed when the mansion was first converted into a research facility. Nothing special, nothing complicated. He selected the appropriate tools and began the removal process, first unscrewing the interior and exterior escutcheons, then carefully extracting the lock cylinder itself. As he worked, Margaret provided background information about Dr. Kirov, mentioning that he had been a pleasant man, quiet, and dedicated to his work on plant genetics. He had kept to himself mostly, spending long hours in the laboratories and rarely socializing with other staff members. His English had been adequate but heavily accented, and he had seemed eager to complete his research and return to the Soviet Union. Eddie nodded politely but focused on his work. He had the cylinder out now and was examining the mechanism when his trained fingers detected something unusual. There was a slight asymmetry in the weight distribution, a minute irregularity that most people would never notice. He held the cylinder up to the light from the window, rotating it slowly. That was when he saw it. Behind the top pin chamber, barely visible in the narrow gap, was a thin strip of metal that had no business being there. Eddie's pulse quickened. In 25 years of professional locksmithing, he had encountered plenty of unusual modifications, hidden keys, makeshift repairs, even a hollowed-out cylinder used to smuggle jewelry during a divorce. But this was different. This was deliberate, sophisticated, and hidden with considerable skill. Margaret had moved to the window and was gazing out at the grounds, giving Eddie space to work. He made a decision in that moment that would change everything. Instead of mentioning the anomaly, he carefully continued removing the cylinder, palming the mechanism as he set it on the desk. Eddie told Margaret he needed to return to his shop to fabricate a custom component for the new lock, a small lie that came surprisingly easily. He would return within the hour to complete the installation. Margaret seemed slightly annoyed by the delay but agreed, escorting him back downstairs into his truck. Back at the shop, Eddie locked the front door and flipped the sign to closed. His hands were shaking slightly as he carried the lock cylinder to his workbench and positioned a high-intensity lamp directly over it. Using a set of precision screwdrivers and a jeweler's loop, he carefully disassembled the mechanism. The metal strip was approximately 2 inches long and 1/4 inch wide, made of thin brass that had been carefully engraved with what appeared to be numerical sequences. Eddie's knowledge of codes and ciphers was limited, but he recognized structure when he saw it. The numbers were arranged in groups of 5, separated by small punch marks. There were 12 such groups in total, running the entire length of the strip. Eddie sat back in his chair, his mind racing. This was clearly not something innocent. A visiting Soviet researcher, a deliberately hidden cipher, the timing during one of the most tense periods of the Cold War. Just weeks earlier, newspapers had been filled with stories about the missile crisis in Cuba, about American ships blockading Soviet vessels, about the world teetering on the brink of nuclear war. Eddie was no expert in international espionage, but he understood that what he held in his hands was potentially significant. The question was, what to do about it? His first instinct was to call the police, but something held him back. This seemed bigger than the Burlington Police Department. Federal authorities would need to be involved, but Eddie had no idea how to contact them. The FBI had an office in Boston, he knew, but would they take him seriously? Would they think he was some paranoid crank seeing Soviet spies under every bed? Eddie decided to document everything first. He used his Kodak camera to photograph the cipher from multiple angles, making sure the numbers were clearly visible. He wrote down every detail he could remember about the room, about Margaret's description of Dr. Kirov, about the lock itself. Then he carefully wrapped the metal strip in tissue paper and locked it in his personal safe. That evening, Eddie sat in his apartment and debated his next move. He had completed the lock installation at the Research Institute, using a different cylinder and making no mention of what he had found. Margaret had paid him the $50 and thanked him for his professionalism. As far as she knew, it had been a routine job. But Eddie could not stop thinking about that cipher. He poured himself a whiskey, something he rarely did on weeknights, and tried to work through the implications. If Kirov had been a spy, what had he been stealing? Margaret had mentioned plant genetics, but that seemed too mundane for the elaborate concealment method. And how did the cipher work? Was it coordinates? Dates? Some kind of rendezvous code? The following morning, Eddie made his decision. He looked up the number for the FBI field office in Boston and placed the call at 9 o'clock sharp. The woman who answered transferred him to an agent named Daniel Corman, whose voice carried the flat vowels of New England. Eddie explained the situation as clearly as he could. emphasizing his professional credentials and trying not to sound like a conspiracy theorist. There was a long pause after Eddie finished speaking. Then Corman asked him to describe the cipher in detail. Eddie did, reading from his notes. Another pause followed. Corman asked if Eddie had told anyone else about this. Eddie said no. Corman instructed him not to discuss the matter with anyone and to expect a visit from federal agents within 24 hours. Eddie should keep his shop closed tomorrow and wait at home. Someone would contact him. The line went dead. Eddie sat holding the receiver, wondering if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life or the most important phone call he would ever make. The following morning, 2 men in dark suits arrived at Eddie's apartment at 8 o'clock. They showed identification that designated them as Special Agents Connor Walsh and Robert Delacroix of the FBI's Counterintelligence Division. Walsh was tall and lean, with close-cropped brown hair and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of Eddie's apartment in seconds. Delacroix was shorter, stockier, with graying hair and the patient demeanor of a man who had been conducting investigations for decades. They sat in Eddie's small living room, Walsh on the threadbare sofa and Delacroix in the armchair near the window. Eddie retrieved the safe from his bedroom and opened it, producing the tissue-wrapped cipher. Walsh handled it with latex gloves, examining it under a portable light he extracted from his briefcase. Delacroix asked Eddie to repeat his entire story from the beginning, interrupting occasionally with specific questions about timelines, about his interactions with Margaret Sutton, about the room's appearance and contents. Walsh looked up from the cipher, his expression grave. He told Eddie that he had stumbled onto something significant, potentially very significant. The numerical sequences matched patterns consistent with Soviet intelligence coding systems. Without revealing classified information, Walsh explained that the FBI had been monitoring certain individuals at research facilities across New England for months, looking for evidence of espionage activities. Dr. Pavel Kirov had been on their watch list, but they had lacked sufficient evidence to justify direct action. Eddie felt a chill run down his spine. He asked if he was in danger. Delacroix assured him that Kirov had already left the country, returning to the Soviet Union as planned. However, Eddie's discovery suggested that Kirov had been part of a larger network, and that network was still operational. The cipher likely contained information about other operatives, meeting locations, or communication protocols. Over the next 3 hours, the agents questioned Eddie exhaustively. They wanted to know everything about the Burlington Research Institute, about the lock removal process, about any other unusual observations he might have made. Eddie described the layout of the building, the laboratories he had passed, the quiet 3rd floor with its temporary accommodations. He mentioned the Russian books in Kirov's room, the photograph of the elderly woman, the papers scattered on the desk. Walsh made several phone calls from Eddie's telephone, speaking in terse sentences filled with terminology Eddie did not understand. When he hung up after the 3rd call, he informed Eddie that a full investigation team would be arriving in Burlington by evening. They would need Eddie's continued cooperation, which might include returning to the Research Institute under some pretext to observe and report on activities there. Eddie agreed without hesitation. The initial fear had passed, replaced by a strange excitement. He was contributing to something important, using his unique skills to serve his country. Walsh warned him that the work could be dangerous, that he should tell no one about the investigation, not friends, not family, certainly not anyone at the Research Institute. Eddie nodded his understanding. That evening, Eddie met with a larger team of federal agents at a motel on the outskirts of Burlington. There were 6 agents in total, including Walsh and Delacroix, along with 2 specialists in cryptography and Soviet intelligence operations. The cryptographers, a man named Victor Chen and a woman named Dorothy Finch, studied the cipher intensely, making notes and consulting thick reference books filled with previous Soviet codes. After an hour of analysis, Chen looked up with barely contained excitement. He explained that the cipher was indeed a Soviet intelligence code, specifically a version used by the GRU, Soviet military intelligence. The numerical sequences, when properly decoded, would likely reveal a combination of geographic coordinates, dates, and possibly personal identification codes. However, breaking the cipher completely would require knowing the specific key phrase or mathematical formula used to generate the code. Dorothy Finch added that the method of concealment, hiding the cipher inside a lock mechanism, was consistent with tradecraft they had observed in other Soviet operations. The lock provided a perfect hiding place because it was a secure location that could only be accessed by someone with specialized knowledge, and it would typically be overlooked during routine security sweeps. The fact that Kirov had chosen this method suggested he was well trained and part of a sophisticated operation. Walsh asked Eddie if he could identify other visiting researchers at the institute who might be Soviet nationals or who had traveled recently to Eastern European countries. Eddie admitted he had no such knowledge, but suggested that Margaret Sutton would have detailed records of all personnel. Walsh nodded, then revealed a troubling piece of information. Their preliminary investigation had uncovered financial irregularities at the Burlington Research Institute. Large sums of money, potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars, had been transferred through accounts linked to shell corporations with ties to Eastern European banks. The picture emerging was of a research facility that had been deliberately compromised, possibly from its inception. The institute might have been established specifically to provide cover for Soviet intelligence gathering operations, using legitimate scientific research as a facade. Visiting scholars from the Soviet Union and its satellite states would have access to genuine research data, some of which might have dual-use applications in weapons development or military technology. Over the next week, Eddie became an unofficial part of the FBI investigation team. He returned to the Research Institute 3 times under various pretexts, installing new security locks in the administrative offices, inspecting the facility's master key system, and conducting a comprehensive audit of all locks in the building. Each visit provided opportunities to observe staff members, to note comings and goings, to identify which rooms seemed to have unusual security measures. During his second visit, Eddie encountered a nervous young man named Gregory Parsons, who worked as a research assistant in one of the biology laboratories. Gregory seemed startled when Eddie appeared in the hallway, quickly closing the door to the lab behind him. The interaction lasted less than 30 seconds, but Eddie noted Gregory's flushed face, his trembling hands, the way his eyes darted toward the exit stairs. He reported the encounter to Walsh that evening. The FBI ran background checks on Gregory Parsons and discovered interesting connections. His mother, it turned out, had been born in Czechoslovakia and had immigrated to the United States in 1946. Gregory had visited Prague twice in the past 3 years, ostensibly to see family members. Phone records showed regular calls to a number in Montreal, Canada, that had been flagged in previous counterintelligence investigations as a potential Soviet front. Walsh decided it was time to expand the surveillance operation. Technical teams installed listening devices in several key locations at the Research Institute, including Gregory's laboratory and Margaret Sutton's office. They also began monitoring all mail entering and leaving the facility, photographing every envelope and package. Eddie's role shifted from active participant to consultant, helping agents understand the building's layout and identifying unusual security features. The breakthrough came on November 2, 1962, exactly 18 days after Eddie discovered the cipher. The listening device in Gregory's laboratory captured a conversation between Gregory and another researcher, a British national named Adrian Holloway. The conversation was brief and superficial, discussing experimental procedures for bacterial cultures, but it contained a single phrase that triggered the FBI's attention. Gregory mentioned that the samples would need to be transported across the lake before the weather turned cold. Lake Champlain lay just a few miles west of Burlington, stretching north into Canada and providing an unguarded border crossing point. Dorothy Finch, analyzing the conversation alongside the decoded portions of the cipher, identified a match. One of the numerical sequences, when decoded, corresponded to coordinates on the lake's eastern shore, near a small cove that was largely hidden from the main roads. Walsh organized a surveillance operation at the cove. Teams of agents, posing as hunters and fishermen, established observation posts in the surrounding woods. They documented every vehicle that arrived, photographed every individual who visited the area, and noted all boat traffic on that section of the lake. For 3 days, nothing unusual occurred. Then, on the evening of November 5th, Gregory Parsons arrived at the cove driving a dark blue sedan. Gregory parked near the water and waited. 20 minutes later, a small motorboat approached from the north, piloted by a man wearing a heavy jacket and a wool cap. The boat pulled up to the shore and the man disembarked. He and Gregory spoke briefly, their voices too low for the directional microphones to capture clearly. Then Gregory retrieved a briefcase from his car and handed it to the man. The exchange took less than 2 minutes. The man returned to his boat and headed north toward Canada. Gregory drove away. FBI agents in a concealed boat followed the courier at a distance. He traveled approximately 8 miles north to a section of the lake that straddled the Canadian border, then pulled his boat onto shore near a small fishing camp on the Canadian side. 2 men met him there, transferred the briefcase to a waiting vehicle, and drove away. The FBI agents, lacking jurisdiction in Canada, could only photograph the exchange and document the license plate of the vehicle. Walsh now had enough evidence to act. The following morning, FBI agents arrested Gregory Parsons at his apartment in Burlington. They also detained Adrian Holloway and 3 other researchers at the institute who had been identified as having suspicious connections. Margaret Sutton was brought in for questioning, though it quickly became apparent that she had been completely unaware of the espionage activities occurring under her supervision. Gregory Parsons, faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of a lengthy prison sentence for espionage, agreed to cooperate. Over the course of several debriefing sessions, he revealed the scope of the operation that had been running at the Burlington Research Institute for nearly 2 years. The operation, Gregory explained, had been organized by Soviet military intelligence with the specific goal of acquiring biological research data that could have applications in weapons development. Dr. Pavel Kirov had been the coordinator, recruiting sympathetic researchers and establishing the communication protocols. The Research Institute had been chosen because it received federal grants for agricultural research that sometimes involved work with pathogenic bacteria and viruses. While the research was ostensibly focused on plant diseases, the underlying methodologies could be adapted for weaponizing biological agents. Gregory described how the operation worked. Selected research data would be photographed using miniature cameras. Then the film would be concealed in seemingly innocent items, like hollowed-out books or false bottom containers. These items would be transported across the Canadian border, either by boat across Lake Champlain or by couriers traveling by car through remote crossing points. From Canada, the material would make its way to Soviet diplomatic facilities, then ultimately to Moscow. The cipher Eddie had discovered was Kirov's personal codebook, containing the coordinates of various drop sites, dates for scheduled exchanges, and identification codes for the Canadian contacts who received the stolen data. By hiding it in a lock, Kirov had ensured that even if his room was searched, the cipher would likely go undetected. He had planned to retrieve it before leaving the country, but circumstances had forced him to depart more quickly than anticipated, leaving the cipher behind. Adrian Holloway was revealed to be a longtime Soviet asset who had been recruited while studying at Cambridge University in the late 1940s. He had immigrated to the United States in 1958 and had worked his way into positions at various research facilities, always seeking access to sensitive biological or chemical research. His role at the Burlington Research Institute had been to identify valuable data and coordinate its transfer to Gregory. The 2 other researchers who were arrested turned out to have more peripheral involvement. One had simply been blackmailed into providing access codes to secure laboratories, threatened with exposure of his homosexuality at a time when such revelation could destroy a career. The other had been an unwitting courier, believing he was transporting legitimate research samples for a colleague. Both provided valuable testimony but faced lesser charges. The investigation expanded beyond Burlington as the FBI used the decoded cipher to identify other locations and operatives. Arrests were made in Montreal, in Albany, and in Boston. A Soviet diplomat was declared persona non grata and expelled from Canada. The entire espionage network, which had involved at least 15 individuals across 3 countries, was systematically dismantled. Eddie watched these developments unfold with a mixture of pride and disbelief. His routine lock-changing job had exposed an international espionage ring. The FBI presented him with a commendation, though it had to remain classified for security reasons. Director J. Edgar Hoover personally wrote a letter thanking Eddie for his vigilance and his willingness to serve his country, though Eddie was instructed never to reveal the letter's existence. The Burlington Research Institute underwent a complete security overhaul. Margaret Sutton resigned her position, devastated by the realization that her facility had been compromised. The board of directors implemented stringent new protocols for vetting visiting researchers, particularly those from communist countries. Federal oversight increased dramatically, with regular security audits and background checks for all personnel. For Eddie, life gradually returned to normal, though nothing felt quite the same. He continued operating his locksmith shop, cutting keys and repairing locks, but he could never again see his work as simply mechanical. Every lock now held the possibility of secrets, every key a potential gateway to hidden information. He had glimpsed a world of shadows and deception that existed parallel to ordinary life, and that glimpse had changed him fundamentally. In December of 1962, Eddie received an unexpected visitor. Connor Walsh appeared at the shop on a gray afternoon, wearing civilian clothes instead of his usual dark suit. He invited Eddie for coffee at a diner across the street. Over burnt coffee and apple pie, Walsh revealed additional details about the investigation that had not been made public. The biological research data stolen by the Soviet network had indeed been intended for weapons development programs. Soviet scientists had been particularly interested in research involving antibiotic-resistant bacterial strains and rapid cultivation techniques. While the data alone would not have enabled them to create biological weapons immediately, it would have accelerated their research by several years, potentially giving them a significant strategic advantage. Walsh also revealed that Dr. Pavel Kirov had been killed in a suspicious automobile accident outside Leningrad 3 weeks after returning to the Soviet Union. Walsh believed, though he could not prove, that Kirov had been eliminated by his own intelligence service, either as punishment for leaving the cipher behind or because he had become a liability who knew too much. The Soviet system was often merciless to its own agents, particularly those who made mistakes. Eddie absorbed this information in silence. He felt no satisfaction in Kirov's death, only a deep sadness at the waste of it all. Kirov had probably been a talented scientist, someone who could have contributed genuine knowledge to humanity's understanding of biology. Instead, he had been consumed by the Cold War's paranoia and duplicity used by his government and ultimately discarded. Walsh then made Eddie an unusual offer. The FBI was always looking for observant citizens who could serve as informal sources of information. Eddie's profession gave him access to businesses, institutions, and private homes throughout Burlington. If he ever encountered anything suspicious, anything that seemed out of place, Walsh wanted him to report it. There would be no formal arrangement, no payment, just an understanding that Eddie would keep his eyes open and his phone line available. Eddie considered the offer carefully. Part of him wanted to decline, to return completely to the simplicity of his previous life. But another part, the part that had been awakened by the discovery of that cipher, understood that the simple life was an illusion. The world was complicated and dangerous, and those dangers did not respect the boundaries between ordinary existence and international intrigue. He agreed to Walsh's proposal. Over the following years, Eddie did occasionally report observations to Walsh or his successors. Most led nowhere, innocent oddities that had simple explanations. But twice more, Eddie's professional work intersected with matters of national security. Once, he discovered evidence of industrial espionage at a manufacturing plant. Another time, he identified a forged passport being used by a man wanted for smuggling military technology. Each time, Eddie's unique skills and observant nature proved valuable. The story of how Eddie Halpern discovered a Soviet spy remained classified for more than 2 decades. It was not until the mid-1980s, as Cold War tensions began to ease, that portions of the case were declassified and became part of the public record. By then, Eddie was in his 60s, still operating the Locksmith shop on Church Street, still living in the apartment above with its view of downtown Burlington. A local newspaper eventually published a feature article about Eddie's role in exposing the espionage ring. The reporter painted him as a humble patriot, a working-class hero who had served his country simply by doing his job with care and attention. Eddie gave a single interview for the article, uncomfortable with the attention but willing to share the story now that security restrictions had been lifted. In the interview, Eddie reflected on what the experience had taught him. He spoke about the importance of craftsmanship, of knowing one's trade so thoroughly that anomalies become immediately apparent. He talked about civic duty, about the responsibility that comes with specialized knowledge and access, and he discussed the thin line between paranoia and vigilance, between seeing conspiracies everywhere and recognizing genuine threats when they emerge. The article brought a brief surge of customers to Eddie's shop, people who wanted to meet the man who had caught a Soviet spy. Eddie tolerated the attention with patient good humor, always redirecting conversations back to the practical matters of locks and keys. He gave no speeches, sought no further publicity, and declined several offers to write a book about his experiences. What the article did not mention, because Eddie never spoke about it publicly, was the cost of his involvement. For months after the investigation concluded, Eddie had difficulty sleeping. He kept imagining scenarios where the espionage ring discovered his role, where Soviet agents came for revenge. He checked his locks obsessively, varied his daily routines, and startled at unexpected sounds. The paranoia eventually faded, but it left a residue of permanent wariness. Eddie also never fully resolved his feelings about the ethical dimensions of the case. The researchers who had been arrested and prosecuted had families, had careers that were destroyed, had lives that were fundamentally derailed. Gregory Parsons served 8 years in federal prison and never worked in science again. Adrian Holloway died in prison in 1971, a broken man estranged from his family. Eddie understood intellectually that they had betrayed their country, had endangered national security, had made choices that warranted punishment, but emotionally, he could not escape the sense of having participated in their destruction. These doubts never led Eddie to regret his decision to report the cipher. The moral calculus was clear enough. The biological weapons research that the stolen data supported could have killed thousands or millions of people. Individual tragedies had to be weighed against collective security. Still, Eddie carried the weight of those choices, understanding that there were no clean victories in the murky world of intelligence and counterintelligence. In 1987, Eddie finally retired from the locksmith business. He sold the shop to a young man named Robert Chen, who had apprenticed with him for 3 years. Eddie kept the apartment above the shop, maintaining his connection to the building that had defined most of his adult life. He spent his retirement reading extensively, taking long walks through Burlington, and occasionally visiting his daughter, Michelle, in Boston, their relationship having slowly healed over the decades. Connor Walsh remained in contact with Eddie until Walsh's death in 1993. They had developed an unlikely friendship, two men from different worlds connected by shared experiences that could never be fully explained to outsiders. Walsh, in his final months, told Eddie that the Burlington case remained one of the most significant counterintelligence successes of his career, not for its scale, which was modest compared to some operations, but for its precision. A single observant locksmith had unraveled an entire network through careful attention to his craft. The cipher itself, that thin strip of brass with its engraved numerical sequences, eventually ended up in a classified collection at FBI headquarters in Washington. Eddie saw it one last time in 1990, when he was invited to a ceremony marking the 25th anniversary of his discovery. By then, many of the documents related to the case had been declassified, and the FBI was publicly acknowledging the contributions of civilians who had assisted in counterintelligence operations during the Cold War. Standing in that sterile conference room in Washington, looking at the cipher displayed under glass, Eddie was struck by how small and unassuming it appeared. This tiny piece of metal had represented the intersection of massive historical forces, the Cold War rivalry between superpowers, the constant shadow war of espionage and counter-espionage, the paranoia and danger that had defined an entire generation. Yet it was also intimately personal, a testament to the skills his father had taught him, to the pride he took in his craft, to the moment when ordinary work had revealed extraordinary circumstances. Eddie returned to Burlington after the ceremony, carrying memories of handshakes and congratulations from FBI officials he would never see again. He resumed his quiet retirement, watching the world change around him as the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War that had shaped so much of his adult life finally ended. The fears and tensions that had seemed so permanent proved to be temporary, though Eddie knew that new fears and new tensions would inevitably replace them. The locksmith shop on Church Street continued to thrive under Robert Chen's ownership. Chen maintained Eddie's standards of craftsmanship and attention to detail, building on the reputation that Eddie had established over decades. Sometimes customers would mention that they had heard about Eddie's role in the spy case, and Chen would smile and confirm the story, always adding that Eddie had been the finest locksmith he had ever known, that his real legacy was not a single dramatic discovery, but countless routine jobs completed with skill and integrity. In the years following his retirement, Eddie occasionally reflected on the arbitrary nature of his involvement in the spy case. If Margaret Sutton had called a different locksmith, if Kirov had successfully retrieved the cipher before departing, if Eddie had been less observant or less willing to report his discovery, the entire network might have continued operating for years. History often turned on such small contingencies, on moments when chance and character intersected to produce consequences far beyond anyone's initial intentions. Eddie also thought often about Pavel Kirov, the man he had never met but whose secrets he had exposed. He wondered about Kirov's motivations, whether he had been driven by ideology, by blackmail, by promises of reward, or by some combination of factors. The binary categories of hero and villain that Cold War propaganda had promoted seemed inadequate when Eddie tried to imagine Kirov as a complete human being, someone with hopes and fears and complicated loyalties. The automobile accident that had killed Kirov haunted Eddie's imagination, the possibility that a man's life had been ended simply because he had failed at espionage. By the late 1990s, Eddie's health began to decline. Heart problems that had first appeared a decade earlier became more serious, requiring medication and lifestyle adjustments. He moved from the apartment above the shop to a ground-floor unit in a complex designed for seniors, where he could avoid stairs and have easier access to medical care. Michelle visited more frequently, bringing his 3 grandchildren who listened with fascination to carefully edited versions of Grandpa's adventures as a locksmith. Eddie died peacefully in his sleep on March 11, 2001, at the age of 82. His obituary in the Burlington Free Press mentioned his long career as a locksmith and included a brief paragraph about his role in exposing a Soviet spy ring in 1962. The funeral was well attended, drawing not only family and friends, but also several retired FBI agents who had worked on the case, including Robert Delacroix, who at 91 made the trip from Boston specifically to pay his respects. At the funeral, Michelle found among her father's possessions a small wooden box containing memorabilia from the spy case. There was a copy of the photograph Eddie had taken of the Cipher, now yellowed with age. There was the classified letter from J. Edgar Hoover, its existence no longer secret after so many years. There were newspaper clippings from when the story was finally made public, and a few personal notes Eddie had written but never shared, reflections on duty and conscience, and the unexpected ways that ordinary lives intersect with history. Michelle donated these items to the Vermont Historical Society, where they became part of a collection documenting the state's Cold War history. Researchers occasionally examined them, using Eddie's story to illustrate the human dimension of espionage, the way intelligence operations depended not just on sophisticated technology and trained agents, but also on ordinary citizens who noticed when something was wrong and had the courage to report it. The Burlington Research Institute continued operating until 2008, when financial difficulties and declining federal research grants forced its closure. The Victorian mansion that had housed it stood empty for several years before being purchased by developers and converted into luxury condominiums. Few of the new residents knew about the building's history, about the espionage that had occurred within its walls, about the cipher hidden in a lock that had exposed an international conspiracy. In the end, Eddie Halpern's story became what he had always wanted it to be, a footnote in the larger history of his era, acknowledged but not celebrated, remembered but not sensationalized. He had lived a life defined by craftsmanship and quiet integrity, punctuated by a single extraordinary moment when those qualities proved to have significance beyond their immediate context. The cipher in the lock became a metaphor for Eddie's entire approach to existence, the belief that careful attention to detail, thorough knowledge of one's craft, and willingness to act on what one discovered were the fundamental virtues that connected private work to public good. Years after Eddie's death, Connor Walsh's successor as head of the FBI's Boston Counterintelligence Division gave a lecture at the University of Vermont about Cold War espionage in New England. He concluded his talk by discussing the Burlington case, describing it as exemplary of what he called vigilant citizenship, the practice of being alert to anomalies without becoming paranoid, of being willing to report concerns without succumbing to conspiracy theories, of maintaining both civic engagement and professional excellence. The agent showed slides of the Cipher, of the Burlington Research Institute, and of Eddie Halpern's locksmith shop. He emphasized that while dramatic spy cases involving elaborate surveillance operations and international intrigue made for compelling narratives, the vast majority of successful counterintelligence work depended on exactly the kind of observant professionalism that Eddie had demonstrated. Intelligence services could deploy technical resources and trained personnel, but they could never replace the distributed awareness that came from citizens who knew their communities and their trades deeply enough to recognize when something was out of place. The lecture was attended by about 70 people, including several current and former locksmiths who had known Eddie or known of him. In the question period that followed, one of these locksmiths, a woman named Patricia Donovan, raised her hand and asked whether the profession had learned anything lasting from Eddie's experience. The FBI agent thought carefully before responding. He suggested that the lesson was not specific to locksmithing or even to espionage. The fundamental insight was about the value of expertise, not just as technical competency but as a form of civic knowledge. Every profession, every trade, every specialized skill created opportunities to observe aspects of society that others could not see. Locksmiths accessed the security systems that protected homes and businesses. Plumbers saw the infrastructure hidden behind walls. Electricians understood the flow of power through buildings. Accountants tracked money through complex financial systems. Each form of expertise provided a unique vantage point, and collectively these vantage points created a comprehensive picture of how society functioned and where vulnerabilities existed. Eddie Halpern, the agent concluded, had exemplified the possibility that expertise could serve purposes beyond immediate professional application. His story remained relevant not because Soviet espionage was still a pressing threat, though other forms of espionage certainly were, but because it illustrated how individuals could contribute to collective security simply by being good at what they did and paying attention to what that work revealed. The applause that followed was sustained and genuine. After the lecture ended, several audience members approached the agent to share their own stories of Eddie, small memories of interactions with a modest man who had cut their keys or repaired their locks or given advice about security systems. These fragmentary recollections, accumulated and shared, created a portrait more complete than any official account could capture, showing Eddie as he had actually been: dedicated craftsman, reluctant hero, ordinary citizen who had done something extraordinary without ever losing sight of the ordinary work that defined his life. Jennifer's report, when completed, became an important internal document at the FBI, used to train new agents about the role of civilian cooperation in counterintelligence work. The Burlington case featured prominently as an example of how technical expertise in seemingly mundane fields could produce critical intelligence breakthroughs. Jennifer sent Eddie a copy of the unclassified portions of her report, and he read it with interest, seeing his actions analyzed and contextualized within broader intelligence frameworks. The mid-1980s also brought the beginning of Eddie's courtship with a woman named Helen Archer, a librarian at the Fletcher Free Library in Burlington. They met when Eddie came to research the history of locksmithing for a talk he had agreed to give at the local historical society. Helen helped him locate relevant books and documents, and their professional interaction evolved into personal friendship over several months. Helen was 61, 4 years younger than Eddie, a widow whose husband had died of cancer 3 years earlier. Their relationship developed slowly, built on shared interests and compatible temperaments. Helen appreciated Eddie's quiet competence, his deep knowledge of his craft, and his thoughtful approach to questions of duty and responsibility. Eddie found in Helen an intellectual companionship he had not experienced since his marriage to Clara, someone who enjoyed discussing ideas and books, who could challenge his perspectives without dismissing them. They attended concerts together, took weekend trips to see Vermont's autumn foliage, and gradually became integral parts of each other's lives without feeling the need to formalize their relationship through marriage. Helen already knew about Eddie's role in the spy case when they met, having read the newspaper articles years earlier. She was interested in the details but not obsessed with them, treating that chapter of Eddie's life as significant but not defining. This balanced perspective suited Eddie perfectly. He wanted someone who understood what had happened but did not reduce him to that single experience, who could appreciate both the locksmith and the man who had caught a spy without confusing one for the other. The fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 stunned Eddie as it stunned much of the world. He watched the television coverage with Helen, seeing jubilant Germans tearing down the structure that had symbolized Cold War division for nearly 3 decades. The images carried almost surreal quality, suggesting that immutable political realities could dissolve overnight when circumstances aligned properly. Eddie felt complex emotions watching the celebrations: joy at the liberation of people who had lived under oppression, satisfaction that the system he had fought against was crumbling, but also a strange sense of loss, as if a defining feature of his adult life was being erased. When the Soviet Union itself collapsed in December 1991, Eddie and Walsh had a long phone conversation, processing what it meant. Walsh, who had devoted his entire career to combating Soviet intelligence operations, expressed both vindication and melancholy. He had been right about the fundamental instability of the Soviet system, right to believe it would eventually fail, but the victory, if it could be called that, felt hollow after so many years of struggle, so many resources expended, so many lives disrupted or destroyed by the conflict between systems. Walsh wondered aloud what his career would have been if not defined entirely by Cold War concerns, what kind of person he might have become without that constant adversarial framework. Eddie understood those feelings because he shared them to a lesser degree. The cipher hidden in a lock, discovered in October 1962, had been a response to dangers that were real and immediate at that moment. The fact that the Soviet Union had ultimately collapsed from internal contradictions rather than external pressure did not negate the importance of resisting its espionage efforts during the decades when its survival seemed assured. But Eddie could acknowledge that history was more complicated than simple narratives of good versus evil, that even necessary vigilance carried costs that should not be forgotten or minimized. The 1990s were years of relative calm for Eddie. He fully retired from active locksmithing in 1994, selling the business to Robert Chen and maintaining only occasional consulting relationships with former clients who requested his expertise on particularly challenging problems. He spent more time with Michelle and her family, developing warm relationships with his grandchildren. He traveled with Helen to places he had never imagined visiting, Europe mostly, where they toured museums and historical sites and ate at restaurants that would have seemed impossibly sophisticated to the young Eddie who had inherited a locksmith shop from his father. In Rome, Eddie visited a museum of ancient Roman locks and keys, marveling at mechanisms that were 2,000 years old but embodied principles still relevant to modern locksmithing. The Romans had understood pin-tumbler systems, had developed warded locks of considerable sophistication, had created security devices that demonstrated both mechanical ingenuity and cultural anxiety about theft and intrusion. Eddie stood before a display case containing bronze keys from the 1st century and felt a profound connection to the anonymous craftsmen who had forged them, recognizing in their work the same attention to precision and function that he had tried to bring to his own craft. Walsh died in February 1993 after a brief illness. Eddie traveled to New Hampshire for the funeral, finding himself among a large gathering of former FBI agents, family members, and friends. The eulogies painted a picture of a man who had been complex and occasionally difficult, driven by conviction but also capable of doubt, a dedicated professional whose personal life had been somewhat sacrificed to the demands of his work. Eddie spoke briefly at the service, describing Walsh not as a superior or a government official but as a friend who had shared unusual experiences and had remained connected across decades. After Walsh's death, Eddie found himself increasingly becoming the keeper of the Burlington spy case's memory. The other principals in the investigation either had died or moved on to circumstances where the case was a distant footnote. Journalists occasionally contacted Eddie for interviews when they were researching Cold War espionage stories. He granted some of these requests, always careful to verify that nothing he said would compromise ongoing security concerns, though, as years passed, fewer restrictions applied to events from the early 1960s. One particularly thoughtful journalist, a woman named Rachel Morrison, writing for the Atlantic magazine, spent several days with Eddie in 1996, conducting extensive interviews. Her resulting article, titled The Locksmith Cipher, examined not just the spy case itself, but its meaning within the broader context of civilian contributions to Cold War security. Rachel's writing captured the paradox Eddie embodied, a man who had done something extraordinary but insisted on understanding it as ordinary work properly executed. The article won several journalism awards and introduced Eddie's story to a national audience. The attention brought by Rachel's article led to other opportunities. Eddie was invited to speak at intelligence community conferences, at historical society meetings, and at gatherings of locksmith associations. He accepted some invitations and declined others, never comfortable with being treated as any kind of expert on espionage or international affairs. When he did speak, he focused on themes of craftsmanship and observation, on the importance of knowing one's field deeply enough to recognize anomalies, on the responsibility that comes with specialized knowledge. Helen died suddenly of a stroke in May 1998. She was 74, in generally good health, and her death was entirely unexpected. Eddie found her collapsed in her apartment when he arrived for their usual Sunday breakfast. The paramedics said she had probably died quickly, without suffering, but Eddie found little comfort in that knowledge. He had lost the person who had become his primary companion, the one who understood both his past and his present, who could draw him out of his solitary tendencies and remind him that connection to others gave life meaning beyond mere competence at one's work. The grief that followed Helen's death was different from what Eddie had experienced when his father died. Joseph's passing had been expected, the culmination of a long decline. Helen's death was a sudden rupture, leaving Eddie disoriented and struggling to reconstruct routines that had come to revolve around her presence. Michelle came to Burlington and stayed with her father for 2 weeks, providing both practical help and emotional support. She helped him sort through Helen's belongings, arrange the memorial service, and begin the difficult process of adjusting to renewed solitude. In the months after Helen died, Eddie found himself thinking more about the spy case than he had in years. The investigation had been a period when his life had expanded beyond familiar boundaries, when he had been drawn into events larger than himself. Losing Helen felt like another kind of boundary, a reminder that even the most meaningful connections were temporary, subject to the arbitrary terminations that mortality imposed. Eddie did not become morbid or depressed, but he turned more reflective, spending long hours considering what his life had meant and what traces it would leave. Eddie also reconnected more deeply with his Jewish heritage during this period. His family had been secular, focused more on cultural identity than religious practice, but after Helen's death, Eddie began attending services at Ohavi Zedek Synagogue in Burlington. He found comfort in rituals that connected him to traditions, stretching back centuries, to communities that had survived persecution and displacement through determination to preserve their identities. The locksmith work his father and grandfather and great-grandfather had done suddenly seemed part of a larger pattern of Jewish emphasis on skilled trades, on portable knowledge that could sustain families even when circumstances forced migration. Rabbi Daniel Rosenstein at Ohavi Zedek became someone Eddie could talk with about questions of meaning and legacy. The rabbi was interested in Eddie's spy case experience and saw theological dimensions in it. He suggested that Eddie's discovery of the cipher was an example of tikkun olam, the Jewish concept of repairing the world through righteous action. By preventing biological weapons data from reaching those who would use it for destructive purposes, Eddie had literally helped protect life and reduce suffering. That his action emerged from simply doing his work well demonstrated how ordinary righteousness could serve cosmic purposes. Eddie was not sure he accepted the theological interpretation, but he appreciated the framework it provided for understanding his experience. The idea that competent work served larger purposes resonated with beliefs he had held throughout his life, even when those beliefs were not explicitly religious. He had always understood that doing any job well contributed to social order, to the functioning of communities, to the maintenance of trust that allowed people to cooperate. The spy case had simply made those connections more visible and dramatic than usual. The dawn of the 21st century found Eddie in his early 80s, still living independently, still mentally sharp though physically slower. He had outlived most of his generation, the men and women who had fought World War II and navigated the Cold War and built the post-war American prosperity. Younger people sometimes treated him as a relic, a link to a supposedly simpler time, but Eddie resisted that characterization. His era had not been simple, had confronted its own complexities and dangers, had made its own mistakes while seeking its own solutions. The terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, profoundly affected Eddie as they affected most Americans. He watched the towers fall on television, saw the smoke rising from the Pentagon, absorbed the news of the Pennsylvania crash, and recognized that the world had shifted again. The Soviet threat he had helped counter in his small way was gone, replaced by different dangers that would define a new era. Eddie felt old that day, aware that the paradigms he understood were giving way to conflicts shaped by forces he did not fully comprehend. In the final months of his life, Eddie returned often to the memory of that October morning in 1962 when his fingers had detected something wrong with a lock mechanism. The memory remained vivid, more clear than many more recent experiences. He could still feel the asymmetric weight distribution, still see the thin brass strip when he extracted it, still recall his racing pulse as he realized he held something significant. That moment had been the hinge on which his ordinary life had briefly opened into history, and it had taught him that boundaries between ordinary and extraordinary were more permeable than most people imagined. The cipher that Eddie discovered, that thin strip of brass with its encoded secrets, remained in the FBI's collection, occasionally displayed in classified briefings as an example of Soviet tradecraft from the Cold War era. But its deeper significance lay not in the specific intelligence it contained or the particular network it helped expose. Its meaning resided in the moment of its discovery, in the intersection of professional skill and civic duty, in the proof that vigilance and craftsmanship could combine to protect the vulnerable spaces where freedom and security met. Eddie Halpern never claimed to be anyone special. He insisted throughout his life that he had simply done what any competent locksmith would have done, noticed an anomaly and reported it. But the truth, as recognized by those who had worked with him and learned from his example, was more profound. Eddie had embodied a form of citizenship that balanced specialization with responsibility, that maintained excellence in mundane work while remaining alert to larger implications, that served both immediate clients and broader communities without confusion or conflict between these obligations. The lock itself, the mechanism that had concealed Pavel Kirov's cipher, was not preserved. It had been disassembled during the investigation, its components scattered among evidence collections and eventually discarded when the case was finally closed. Only the cipher survived, testament to the ingenuity of those who sought to hide secrets and the skill of those who found them. In Burlington today, few visible reminders of the spy case remain. The research institute is gone, converted to other purposes. Eddie's locksmith shop operates under different ownership and a different name. The locations where arrests were made and surveillance was conducted have been redeveloped or repurposed. History moves forward, covering the past with layers of new construction and contemporary concerns. Yet stories persist, passed down through families and professional communities, transformed by repetition but retaining essential truths. The tale of the locksmith who found a Soviet spy becomes part of local folklore, a reminder that small cities far from centers of power can still find themselves touched by international events, that ordinary work can have extraordinary consequences, that attention and integrity matter even, or especially, in routine tasks. Eddie Halpern's legacy ultimately consisted not of dramatic revelations or celebrated heroics, but of consistent professionalism across thousands of forgotten jobs, punctuated by one moment when that professionalism intersected with circumstances that demanded more than technical competency. He met that demand not by becoming someone different, but by remaining exactly who he had always been, a skilled craftsman who took his work seriously and understood that doing so meant accepting whatever responsibilities that seriousness imposed. The cipher in the lock, discovered in a quiet hallway on an October afternoon in 1962, represented the convergence of many forces: Cold War paranoia, Soviet espionage, American counterintelligence, individual choices to betray or to serve, and the accumulated knowledge of 4 generations of Polish locksmiths who had passed their craft from father to son. From that convergence emerged consequences that rippled outward, dismantling networks, ending careers, saving lives that would have been endangered by biological weapons, and confirming for one modest craftsman that the work he did mattered in ways both immediate and profound. When students at the University of Vermont now study Cold War history, they sometimes encounter Eddie Halpern's story in their coursework. Professors use it to illustrate the complexity of intelligence operations, the importance of human sources, and the role of ordinary citizens in national security. The story serves pedagogical purposes, providing a concrete example that brings abstract concepts to life. But for those who knew Eddie, who learned from him or worked alongside him or simply had their keys cut by his skilled hands, the story means something more personal, a reminder that character and competence can combine to create moments of genuine consequence, that the careful work of honest people forms the foundation upon which larger structures of security and freedom rest. The investigation that followed Eddie's discovery had tentacles that reached far beyond what anyone initially suspected. In the weeks after Gregory Parsons began cooperating with federal authorities, a more complex picture emerged of how the Burlington Research Institute had been compromised. The facility had been established in 1960 with funding from a combination of private donors and federal agricultural grants. What investigators discovered was that several of the private donors were connected to front organizations that ultimately traced back to Soviet intelligence services. The funding scheme had been remarkably sophisticated. Money flowed through a series of charitable foundations and investment firms, each layer designed to obscure the ultimate source. A foundation in Switzerland would donate to a research trust in Canada, which would then provide grants to American institutions conducting agricultural science. The paperwork appeared legitimate at every stage, but the entire structure had been engineered to place Soviet intelligence money into American research facilities where it could buy influence and access. Margaret Sutton, when confronted with this information during her interviews with FBI agents, had been genuinely devastated. She had believed she was running a legitimate scientific institution, providing opportunities for international collaboration that would advance human knowledge. The realization that she had been manipulated, that her idealism had been exploited by intelligence operatives who saw science merely as another battlefield in the Cold War, broke something fundamental in her worldview. She resigned her position at the Institute within days of learning the full scope of the deception. Eddie learned about these additional details during his ongoing debriefings with Walsh and the other agents. Each revelation added layers to his understanding of what he had stumbled into. The cipher had been just one piece of a much larger puzzle, and solving that puzzle required months of patient investigation across multiple countries and jurisdictions. The FBI worked closely with the CIA, with Canadian intelligence services, and with law enforcement agencies across several states to map the entire network. One particularly interesting discovery involved the photograph Eddie had seen in Kirov's room, the silver-framed image of an elderly woman. Dorothy Finch, the cryptography specialist, had requested that photograph be retrieved and analyzed. What she found was that the image itself contained a steganographic code, information hidden within the photograph, using subtle variations in tone and contrast that were invisible to the naked eye, but could be extracted using specialized photographic techniques. The code contained additional contact information and operational instructions that supplemented the cipher hidden in the lock. This revelation highlighted the multiple redundancy systems Soviet intelligence built into their operations. If Kirov had been unable to retrieve the cipher from the lock, he still had the photograph as a backup. If both were compromised, there were likely additional hidden codes in his other possessions that investigators never found. The sophistication of the tradecraft impressed even seasoned counterintelligence professionals who had been tracking Soviet operations for decades. Eddie also learned more about the biological research that had been stolen. The Burlington Research Institute had been conducting legitimate work on plant pathogens, studying bacteria and fungi that attacked crops. However, the methodologies developed for studying plant diseases could be readily adapted to human pathogens. Techniques for rapid cultivation, for maintaining bacterial cultures, for understanding transmission mechanisms, all of this knowledge had dual-use applications. Soviet military scientists were particularly interested in developing biological weapons that could target food supplies, creating famines that would weaken enemy nations without the obvious aggression of conventional military attacks. The data stolen from Burlington would have accelerated Soviet bioweapons research by an estimated 3 to 5 years, according to classified assessments that Walsh shared with Eddie. That acceleration could have meant the difference between deterrence and catastrophe in a future conflict. The fact that Eddie's discovery had prevented that outcome gave Walsh visible satisfaction. He told Eddie during one of their coffee meetings that the locksmith had potentially saved thousands of lives, maybe more, by being observant enough to notice something wrong with a lock mechanism. Eddie struggled with this framing. He appreciated that his actions had positive consequences, but he resisted the idea that he was personally responsible for saving lives. He had done his job, nothing more. The implications of that job happening to intersect with matters of national security were not something he could take credit for, any more than a person could take credit for being struck by lightning. Circumstances had chosen him, not the other way around. Yet Walsh's perspective contained truth that Eddie could not entirely dismiss. Circumstances might be arbitrary, but responses to circumstances were not. Eddie could have ignored the anomaly in the lock. He could have convinced himself it was irrelevant, that he was imagining significance where none existed. He could have decided that getting involved with federal authorities was too much trouble, too risky, too far outside his sphere of concern. Every one of those responses would have been understandable, defensible even. But Eddie had chosen differently, and that choice mattered regardless of how arbitrary the initial circumstance had been. The trial of Gregory Parsons and Adrian Holloway took place in federal court in Burlington in the spring of 1963. The proceedings were partly closed to the public because of the classified nature of much of the evidence. Eddie was called to testify about his discovery of the cipher, walking the jury through the technical details of lock mechanisms and explaining how he had recognized that something was wrong. His testimony lasted less than an hour, but it established the foundation for all the evidence that followed. Watching Parsons and Holloway in the courtroom affected Eddie more than he had anticipated. These were not monsters or caricatures of evil. Parsons was a thin young man with nervous hands and a defeated posture, someone who looked more pathetic than dangerous. Holloway maintained more dignity, sitting straight in his chair and meeting the eyes of witnesses without flinching, but even he seemed diminished by the circumstances, a middle-aged academic whose carefully constructed life had collapsed around him. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, photographs of documents that had been smuggled to Canadian contacts, testimony from the courier who had met Parsons at the lake, a Canadian citizen who had agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced charges, detailed analysis of the cipher and the photograph showing how they contained operational intelligence, bank records demonstrating payments received by Holloway from suspicious sources. The defense attorneys fought hard but had little material to work with. Their clients had been caught thoroughly, documented comprehensively, betrayed by their own elaborate security measures. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Parsons received a sentence of 12 years in federal prison. Holloway, whose involvement was more extensive and whose recruitment of others demonstrated greater culpability, received 18 years. Eddie sat in the courtroom gallery as the sentences were announced, feeling neither satisfaction nor grief, only a heavy awareness of consequences unfolding. After the trial concluded, Eddie's life slowly returned to its previous rhythms. The locksmith shop required his attention. Customers needed their keys and their locks, and the mundane work that had been interrupted by espionage investigations resumed. But Eddie noticed changes in himself that persisted long after the excitement of the case had faded. He was more observant now, not just about locks, but about people, about situations, about the subtle indicators that something might be wrong. This heightened awareness brought both benefits and burdens. Eddie became better at his work, noticing potential security vulnerabilities that he would have previously overlooked. He advised clients about weaknesses in their lock systems, recommended upgrades that would genuinely improve their safety, and developed a reputation as someone who understood security at a deeper level than most locksmiths. But the awareness also made him suspicious in ways that were not always healthy. He found himself analyzing people's behavior, wondering about their motives, seeing potential deception where there was probably only ordinary human complexity. Clara, Eddie's ex-wife, reached out to him about 6 months after the trial. She had read about his involvement in the spy case in the newspapers and wanted to express her congratulations. They met for lunch at a restaurant near the waterfront, their first face-to-face conversation in over 2 years. Clara looked well, Eddie thought, more relaxed than she had been during their marriage. She had remarried, she told him, to a man who worked in insurance and treated her with consistent kindness. They talked for nearly 2 hours, covering territory both familiar and new. Clara explained that she had left not because of anything Eddie had done wrong, but because their life together had felt small to her, constrained by routines that never varied and expectations that never expanded. She had needed something different, though she acknowledged that what she found was not necessarily better, just different in ways that suited her temperament. Eddie listened without defensiveness. recognizing truth in her description, even as he maintained that his life had provided satisfactions she had been unable to appreciate. When Clara asked about the spy case, Eddie provided a careful summary, omitting classified details but conveying the essential story. Clara seemed impressed but also unsurprised. She told Eddie that his attention to detail, his insistence on doing things properly, had always been both his greatest strength and his most defining characteristic. Of course he would notice something hidden in a lock that others would miss. Of course he would report it to authorities rather than ignoring it or exploiting it for personal gain. These responses were consistent with who Eddie fundamentally was. The conversation ended with mutual expressions of goodwill. They would not be friends, Eddie understood, but they were no longer adversaries. The divorce had been necessary for Clara, and Eddie could accept that without bitterness. Michelle, their daughter, would benefit from having parents who could interact civilly rather than carrying resentment through the years. Eddie paid for lunch, and they parted on the sidewalk outside the restaurant, shaking hands with genuine warmth before walking in different directions. The relationship Eddie developed with Michelle deepened significantly in the years following the spy case. She had been 13 when her parents divorced, old enough to feel the disruption acutely but too young to understand all the factors involved. By the time she was 16, she was asking more sophisticated questions about her father's work and his involvement in catching Soviet spies. Eddie answered honestly, trying to help her understand that extraordinary events could emerge from ordinary circumstances, that doing one's job well sometimes meant accepting unexpected responsibilities. Michelle visited Burlington during her college breaks, spending time at the locksmith shop and learning aspects of the trade. She did not want to become a locksmith herself. Her interests ran more toward teaching and literature, but she appreciated the craftsmanship her father embodied. Watching him work, seeing the patience and precision he brought to every task, gave her standards she carried into her own pursuits. When she eventually became a high school English teacher in Boston, she approached that work with the same dedication to excellence that Eddie brought to locksmithing. Eddie also maintained contact with several of the FBI agents who had worked on the investigation. Walsh remained the primary connection, but Eddie met occasionally with Dorothy Finch and Robert Delacroix as well. These meetings were social rather than professional, dinners or coffee where they could discuss the case from the comfortable distance of time past. Dorothy, who had been so focused and intense during the investigation, revealed a wry sense of humor and a deep affection for classical music. Robert, whose patient questioning style had been so effective during witness interviews, turned out to be an amateur painter who created landscapes of surprising sensitivity. These friendships, unexpected and genuine, enriched Eddie's life in ways he had not anticipated. He had always been somewhat solitary, comfortable with his own company and not particularly motivated to seek out social connections. But these relationships were different because they were built on shared experience that could not be replicated or explained to others. Only people who had worked on the investigation could fully understand what it had meant: the tedium of surveillance, the excitement of breakthroughs, the satisfaction of seeing evidence accumulate into an undeniable pattern. In 1965, Eddie received an invitation to Washington for a ceremony honoring civilians who had contributed to national security during the Cold War. President Lyndon Johnson would be presenting commendations to approximately 30 individuals whose actions had prevented espionage, sabotage, or other threats to American interests. Eddie was torn about attending. The recognition appealed to his sense of pride, but the publicity made him uncomfortable. Walsh finally convinced him by arguing that the ceremony was not really about Eddie personally, but about demonstrating to the public that ordinary citizens played crucial roles in protecting national security. The ceremony took place in the East Room of the White House on a bright May afternoon. Eddie stood among the other honorees, men and women from across the country who had noticed something wrong and reported it, who had protected sensitive information despite pressure or threats, who had resisted recruitment by foreign intelligence services and immediately notified authorities. President Johnson moved down the line, shaking hands and presenting certificates, his famous charm operating at full power as he made each person feel individually recognized and valued. When Johnson reached Eddie, he spent several extra moments in conversation. The president had been briefed on each case and demonstrated genuine interest in the details of how Eddie had discovered the cipher. He asked technical questions about lock mechanisms, nodded thoughtfully at Eddie's answers, and made a joke about how the country needed more people who noticed when things were not quite right. The entire interaction lasted perhaps 3 minutes, but it represented the only time in Eddie's life that he would have direct contact with someone at the highest levels of political power. A photograph was taken of Eddie shaking hands with President Johnson, both men smiling, the American flag visible in the background. Eddie kept that photograph on the wall of his shop for the rest of his career, not prominently displayed but present for those who looked carefully. Customers occasionally noticed it and asked about the story behind it. Eddie would provide a brief explanation, deflecting attention from himself and redirecting toward the broader context of Cold War tensions and the importance of civic vigilance. The mid to late 1960s brought significant changes to Burlington and to the locksmith business. The city was growing, new construction changing its character and bringing different security needs. Eddie adapted by learning about electronic lock systems, about master key configurations for large buildings, about automotive lock technology as cars became more sophisticated. His willingness to continuously expand his knowledge kept the shop competitive even as younger locksmiths with more modern training entered the market. Eddie also began taking on apprentices, young people who wanted to learn the trade properly rather than just acquiring minimum skills. He was a demanding teacher, insisting on precision and understanding rather than mere competence. His apprentices learned not just how to pick locks or cut keys, but why locks worked the way they did, how different mechanisms provided different levels of security, how to analyze a building's vulnerabilities, and recommend appropriate solutions. Several of his apprentices went on to establish successful locksmith businesses in other Vermont cities, carrying forward the standards Eddie had instilled. The Vietnam War brought new tensions to Burlington as it did to communities across America. Eddie watched as protests erupted on the University of Vermont campus, as young people marched against policies they saw as immoral and unjust. His own feelings about the war were complex, shaped by his understanding of Cold War dynamics, but troubled by the mounting casualties and the sense that American leadership was pursuing victory that seemed increasingly unattainable. He did not participate in protests, but neither did he dismiss them as mere youthful rebellion. One afternoon in 1968, a young man came into Eddie's shop, asking if Eddie did work for the Burlington Police Department. Eddie confirmed that he did occasional work for various law enforcement agencies. The young man, who introduced himself as Lawrence, explained that he was trying to understand how police gained access to buildings during raids. He claimed to be researching surveillance tactics for a college paper, but something in his manner set off Eddie's instincts. The questions were too specific, too focused on vulnerabilities rather than general procedures. Eddie provided vague, general answers, and then, after Lawrence left, he called a contact at the Burlington Police Department. It turned out that Lawrence was under investigation as part of a group planning to vandalize a military recruitment center. Eddie's call helped authorities prevent the attack and arrest several individuals who were found to have makeshift explosives. The incident reinforced Eddie's belief that vigilance remained necessary even though the threat had shifted from Soviet espionage to domestic extremism. The 1970s brought personal challenges as Eddie dealt with his father's declining health. Joseph Halpern, who had taught Eddie everything about locks and craftsmanship, developed dementia in his mid-80s. Eddie visited his father at a nursing home several times each week, sitting by the bedside and talking about locks, even when it was unclear how much Joseph understood. Sometimes the old man's eyes would brighten with recognition, and he would make a comment about a particular lock type or technique, a brief emergence of the knowledge that had defined his life. Other times he stared without comprehension, trapped in confusion that no skill could unlock. Joseph died in 1973 at the age of 87. Eddie organized a small funeral attended by family members and several old customers who remembered Joseph from his decades running the locksmith shop. Eddie delivered a brief eulogy, talking about his father's emigration from Poland, his determination to build a life through skilled work, and the values of precision and integrity that he had passed down to his son. Eddie kept his emotions contained during the service, but that night alone in his apartment he wept for the loss not just of his father, but of the direct connection to a generation that had understood certainty in ways that Eddie's generation could not. The middle and late 1970s were years of consolidation for Eddie. The locksmith business operated profitably, without requiring the constant attention it had demanded in earlier decades. Eddie had trained capable employees who could handle most jobs, freeing him to take on only the most complex or interesting work. He began spending more time reading, taking walks, and developing hobbies that had been neglected during his busiest years. He learned to cook properly rather than relying on simple bachelor meals. He took up birdwatching, discovering an unexpected pleasure in patient observation of creatures whose lives followed patterns utterly different from human concerns. Walsh retired from the FBI in 1978 and moved to a small town in New Hampshire. He and Eddie maintained contact through letters and occasional phone calls, their friendship deepening into something that transcended its origins in the spy case. Walsh's letters often reflected on the arc of his career, on cases he could now discuss because they had been declassified, on his thoughts about the intelligence work he had devoted his life to. He expressed doubt sometimes about whether the ends had justified the means, whether the surveillance and deception and moral compromises required by counterintelligence work had been worth whatever security they provided. Eddie responded to these letters with his own reflections, usually shorter and less philosophically ambitious than Walsh's, but genuine in their engagement with difficult questions. Eddie wrote about the nature of duty, about the obligation to act on what one knew even when action brought complications and consequences. He acknowledged the costs, both personal and collective, of living in a society that required constant vigilance against various threats, but he maintained that the alternative, willful blindness to danger, was worse. People could not wish away the existence of those who meant them harm. They could only choose whether to remain alert and prepared or to retreat into comfortable denial. The election of Ronald Reagan in 1980 brought a renewed intensity to Cold War rhetoric. The Soviet Union was again identified explicitly as an evil empire, and defense spending increased dramatically. Eddie watched these developments with mixed feelings, remembering the tensions of the early 1960s, recognizing that the fundamental conflicts between systems and ideologies had never been resolved, only suppressed temporarily. The cipher he had found nearly 2 decades earlier represented a moment in a much longer struggle, and that struggle was clearly not finished. In 1983, Eddie received a visit from a young FBI agent named Jennifer Carlisle, who was conducting background research on Soviet intelligence operations in New England during the 1960s. She had read the file on the Burlington case and wanted to interview Eddie for a comprehensive report she was preparing. Eddie agreed, and they spent an entire afternoon going through every detail of his discovery and the subsequent investigation. Jennifer was impressed by Eddie's precise recall, his ability to remember specific details that most people would have forgotten after 2 decades. At the end of the interview, Jennifer asked Eddie whether he thought the Cold War would ever truly end or whether it would simply continue indefinitely with occasional thaws and escalations. Eddie considered the question carefully before answering. He said that he did not know what the future held, but that systems built on fundamentally opposed principles probably could not coexist peacefully forever. Eventually, one system would collapse or both would destroy each other. He hoped for collapse rather than destruction, but he was not optimistic enough to predict it confidently.